So this paddle's all but finished. I'm going to use Aqua Fortis, which is a mild acid that they used to stain muskets and axe handles and such in the 1800s. And this is the first paddle I've made out of curly maple, and I hope the camera will show the amount of flame that this has in it. Anyway, I think it's going to be quite a stunning paddle when I'm finished. We've had a whole bunch of people that follow us inquire about the shaving horse. So it derives its name, I guess, because one strides it and sits on it like one does a horse. And the earliest known sketch of it dates to 1556 from a book that was published in that year. But historians believe that it dates back a lot further than that. We just don't know. There's no way to actually prove it. But it's quite a simple device. There's one moving part, and this guy here is called the dumbhead. Actually, there's two dumbheads sitting on this guy. But so what we have is a treadle on the bottom for our feet, and it pivots. And the reason this is such a great device is by putting a piece of wood or whatever into the shaving horse, you clamp it with your feet, and that force is really good for opposing a pull force on the material you're working on. So use of draw knives, use of spoke shaves, and one of my favorite tools is the crooked knife. So it just holds it while you're working the wood. And it was used by, I'm soon to get at my lathe. I've got a piece kind of roughed out. I got to do a modification on the tool rest, but yeah, I'm ready to go there. But this was the first device in turning wood. So they'd take the rough material from the forest and they'd rough it down. They'd make a sort of a crude round shape out of it, or even a hexagon or an octagon, something that took sort of the corners off before they took it to the lathe. So that's where we're at. Quite a simple device to make. I'm going to build a new one, hopefully this spring, because I want a longer bench, and I want one that has a bigger throat opening. So this has a maximum that I can get in of about 2 inches, 2 or 3 inches, not even 3. So I'd like to build something I can put a 4, 5-inch chunk of wood in, and a longer one to get more force. So hopefully that happens in the spring when the weather warms up. Anyway, today I'm going to, given this paddle is pretty much done except for some burnishing and then finishing, I'm going to start building a new pair of shoe pack moccasins. So I'm going to make an effort to do an actual tutorial on how to build the shoe pack. But before I get into that, just a wee bit of history about footwear on the frontier. Arriving from Europe, this would have been typical footwear. A fine pair of boots, gentlemen's shoes, hard soles. But on the frontier, they didn't have the ability to build these or often even get them repaired. So our ancestors on the frontier very quickly adapted to the native moccasin. And I'm going to show a tutorial on building a vamp one, pucker toe, also normal center seam, and a winter moccasin. But for this tutorial, I'm going to be talking particularly about the shoe pack. So what I'm trying to do is replicate that, because these bad boys, they're 3 years old, or at least coming on 3 years old, and they're getting a bit tired. So that's what we're building. Last night I finished the first one. And so I'm going to demonstrate the next one step at a time. So essentially it's a double layer of leather on the bottom. I use a baseball stitch for the center seam. Leaves these nice little puckers. It's a real tight seal. It's a strong stitch, and existed long before we ever thought of baseballs and bats. And then it has a high upper. One can put a double liner inside it if they're wearing it in the winter. I prefer not. I have specific winter moccasins, and I have pretty good tolerance for cold, so I prefer no inner moccasin. However, I do have a piece of beaver hide in the bottom of each of these guys. The other thing I did, and I have no first-person reference of this from the time period, is on these ones I sewed in a piece of birch bark. So we build birch bark canoes, and for the most part, they don't leak or leak too badly. And I thought it would lend itself to making them a little more moisture proof. And I'm not convinced that works, so I've skipped that on this one. So back to Europeans arriving on the frontier, they very quickly adapted to the moccasin. Because material is readily available, with a few simple tools, I use a knife, an awl, and a needle. That's all I use. I also employ waxed Irish linen, which is a very common trade item at any trading post, Hudson Bay company, a factory, or whatever. So it was readily available. But the moccasin itself, the shoe pack moccasin, there's only one existing piece that would show that they made footwear like this. But there are numerous references to attaching a harder sole to a native moccasin. Very many. I found one from the Lewis and Clark diaries that said, in looking for quotes in moccasins, that a well-built pair of mocks will last a member of our company 3 to 4 days. So those guys, poor guys, they spend a lot of time around campfires at night, sewing a new pair of moccasins or repairing moccasins. But leather doesn't last. So if we look at museum pieces, and we think of the traditional moccasin that I'm holding here, anything prior to 1800 pretty much is non-existent. There's very few examples of it. And they're all that style. So we make the assumption that that's what natives wore. Definitely for ceremonial, there's no question. But on a day-to-day basis, I've worn these trekking out in the bush, and they simply aren't very functional. They get full of burrs and briars, your ankles get punctured, you're constantly taking them off, and I found them very unfunctional. So in my mind, and they did make winter moccasins like that, so I'm thinking summer moccasins, pure speculation, that they had something similar to this without the double leather. So this is sort of a hybrid, taking European technology of footwear and applying it to the native footwear. So this particular moccasin, you'll notice it's got some pretty nice quill work on it, although it's really, really worn out. It's been around a long time, and it's got beadwork on the side. So they would build moccasins like this for purposely that the vamp, this is called the vamp, this area, they could unsew that when the bottom wore out and sew it onto a new pair of moccasins. And this particular vamp's been on about 3 pair now. Anyway, and they're still going strong. So wee bit about material. These are made from brain tan moose hide. These are made from brain tanned. This is brain tanned deer hide. However, I haven't got a moose in 3 years, so I have no brain tan moose hide. So I made these out of commercial moose hide, and I've dyed them. So just so you know, the material isn't original. And as far as strength goes, its wearability on moose hide, commercial moose hide, is really good. One can't stitch it as close. If you're using brain tan, you can stitch almost to the edge, and that's going to hold. It's not going to pull out, and you can do really fine work on the leather. But on commercial, you have to step back in a bit for each of your stitch holes. Anyway, let's get on to a tutorial. Just before I get into actually building one of these guys, so in looking for quotes, and I darn if I can find the darn thing, but I found a great one from about the time period of the American Revolution. And the husband is leaving his wife in their homestead cabin to head off to join the militia. And in preparation, he builds 3 pair of brand new moccasins. And his wife, of course, is pretty distraught. The fact that he's heading off to war and may not come back. And he says, essentially in his quote, he says, don't worry, dear. He says, with these new moccasins, he says, if those redcoats are running in their heavy boots, he says, I can run them down. And he says, if they're chasing me, he says, well, I can outrun them. So anyway, I wish I could find it, because I think it's 1778 or 9, and it's a classic quote. Anyway, I digress. So in building a moccasin, the first thing to determine, especially a shoe pack, it's different. I don't use a pattern. My pattern is, my mold is my foot. So there's a bit more waste doing it this way. when I build a winter moccasin, I actually make a pattern, but as silly as it sounds, the pattern is basically used with my fingers. So I take the outline on my foot, I add 3 fingers to this side, 3 fingers to this side, 2 fingers to the front, and 1 finger to the back, and then I trace that out. And that's my pattern for making this. But before I determine the size, if I'm wearing an incher moccasin, so basically what I have here is it's a center seam moccasin. I made these out of old horse blankets. So we've got a center seam moccasin with a sole, but on the sole I've got 3 layers of wool. And on the sides I've got 2 layers of wool, just old horse blankets. So I put my foot in that. I put that on the leather I'm going to make my moccasin. Now, if it's a shoe pack, I'm just going to trace that exact shape on the outline. I want it the outside of that. And then I'll add about 1/8 of an inch for stitch allowance on that. So if you look at this moccasin, if I can get it up here, the threads actually go through the bottom. You'd think they'd wear out, but I literally live in these things, and like I said, they're almost 3 years old and they still got a little life left in them. It's because your footprint is inside of the stitching. So the stitching on this is getting a bit worn, but if I were to restitch this, I could probably get another year out of these moccasins, which I'll do. I'll keep them as spares. Anyway, back to making this guy. So what I've done with the soles, I've got my 2 pieces of leather. I've shaped out my foot, and I've allowed that 1/8 of an inch allowance around the outside. I cut the leather I'm going to use. Ideally, this would be brain tan, but like I said, I don't have it. So I make sure that the leather will go from the center, where the center seam is going to be on the toe, around to the heel, at least to the back. So the one on the outside of the foot is going to be a slightly longer piece of leather. And a shoemaker would use, I think I have them over here, a shoemaker would use fancy tools like this. So these are leather punches. And I could punch five holes in a row. They'd all be the right size, they'd all be equally spaced. When I get to the tight curves, I could use a 2-hole punch, and I could go around the really acute angles, and or curve, I should say, and it would be really nice and pretty. They didn't have those in the Frontier. So the tools I'm going to use is my neck knife, my sewing needle, and a triangular awl. Those are the 3 tools. So I've started it here, dead center, where my center seam is going to go up my foot. So it's going to come up on a bit of an angle like that. Then what I'm going to do is make sure I'm keeping my 2 soles together, and about every 1/8 of an inch I'm going to punch a hole. Now it would be a lot easier to use a hammer in that hole punch, but it certainly wouldn't be as authentic. So essentially I'm going to sew this all the way around to the back of the heel. And once I get to the back of the heel, so I'm going to go all the way around every 1/8 of an inch. I'll demonstrate a few. Once I get to the back, where I'm going to end, this stitch that comes up the back of the moccasin, I'm going to stitch it back. So you've got a gap of the stitch. I think it's called a saddle stitch when it's continuous. So when I'm finished, there won't be a gap between where I started. Always put your knot on the outside, by the way. So coming back, I'll be spanning that gap, and I'll demonstrate that when I get about a half an hour into this. So again, a little over 1/8 of an inch, approximately. Another hole. This is a great project for long nights in the winter, sitting by the fire. I have, on one occasion, I had a friend who wanted to go winter trekking with me, didn't have a pair of winter moccasins, so the evening before he arrived, I started. I had enough brain tan material to do it, and I literally made a pair of winter moccasins in one evening. Probably took me about 4 to 5 hours. I sort of went at that guy. Again, if I stitch these too close to the edge, it's going to pull through the leather. So we've got to The other thing is you want to keep this pretty taut as you're going. So it'll end up with a, sort of looks like waves as you're going around. When you're coming back on that same row of stitches, it's going to take the majority of those waves out. And what doesn't come out is going to come out with wear. And next hole. And this is sort of like watching white paint dry at this point. So I'm going to do a few of these, and then when I get to the next step, we'll pick up because we'll start demonstrating again when I come back on this, and then we'll demonstrate me doing the other side. The only different stitch we're using here, we're using 3 stitches. So this is going to end up like a continuous stitch. This guy front to back and coming back. Then we're going to use that baseball stitch on the center of the toe area. We're going to use a baseball stitch on the heel. When we go to put this top on, after this is all trimmed and shaped, we're going to back this up like so. And where we need to start it, it's going to go around the foot and have enough overlap, as I've done on this one. So on my left foot, I make sure the overlap comes across the shorter one that's behind. And that keeps all the snow and debris out. The other thing, even when I do use commercial, back to the strength of leather, you'll notice this is just a tie to hold it closed, and I got it stuffed with some socks. But when I get around to making the ties for the lacing that holds the boot tight on the foot, I always use brain tan deer hide. It's like twice as tough. If you make commercial leather, hide, moose hide, deer hide out of about that dimension, it's going to snap on you. And it's probably going to snap on you when you're in the middle of deep snow on snowshoes. So I always use brain tan when I really need strength to the item. Okay, we're making some progress here. So you saw me start on this half. So this half is sewn completely now. I'll demonstrate how I finish that. And this part, I still got about 4 stitches or so to do in the sole. So you can see on this side, I've done that single stitch all the way down to the back, to the center of the heel, where that part's going to get the baseball stitch put in it. And then I've just gone back, which has filled that in. On this side, which I'm halfway done, almost to the back, so I'm going to start back stitching that until I get to the front. And then the fun part starts, is making these 2 flaps look like a shoe. When you're pushing your awl through, aside from trying to keep equal spacing on everything, you want to make sure that that you're going through 90 degrees, that you're not tilting your awl like this, or it might come out too close to your leather in your sole. So going through straight, it also makes it easier to get the needle through, which can be hard sometimes. Okay, got my last stitch in at the very back, or the heel. So the heel I'm going to leave last, because that's where one gets their adjustment when they're making the moccasin. And so when it's finished, right now it's pretty much vertical to the back of the shoe. But when we're finished this moccasin, this is going to come in on about a 15-degree angle. It sort of follows that line of your foot, if you think about the shape of the back of one's foot. The other interesting thing here, moccasins will stretch. So if you're making a pair, make them tight, because they're going to stretch. If you bought a pair and they're probably stretched too, and you think, oh, they're too big, or you got to put stuff in them to fill them up. Actually, all you got to do is unstitch the back seam, take a little sliver of leather off each side, put it on your foot, pull it back taut, and re-stitch that with a baseball stitch, which I'm going to demonstrate pretty soon here. And that'll tighten that right back up in your foot. By the time you've done that twice, that moccasin's pretty much stretched out and it's not going to move. The other interesting thing about footwear is a lot of the footwear, you can get shoes and boots like European style, custom made, but often the cobbler or shoemaker would just make a shoe.
it had no right or left foot. So the way you made the right and left foot is you wore one on the left foot and you wore one on the right foot. And if we think breaking in shoes now is tough, it must have been pretty brutal. Anyway, moccasins aren't that hard to break in, but like I say, they are going to stretch, so that's the way you can deal with that. Anyway, I'm going to start back stitching this guy now. So the hard part about doing the back stitching is you're going through the same hole you went through for the first stitch, but now you got double the material, and you sort of got to just feel your way to find that hole. You don't want to make a separate hole, because again that could pull out the leather on the moccasin. So you find the hole, and it's just a matter of feeling a little bit and trying to get that guy to come out in the same opening that the previous stitch came out of. The other thing to consider when you're starting this project, when you start at the front and you make that first knot always on the top, when you stitch back you're going to end up on the top. So you want to cut enough thread to go all the way down and all the way back. And when we come out through the top, we're going to come back through 2 or 3 of these stitches and then knot it again here. So, because if the knots are on the bottom, they are going to wear, even though the stitches won't, or very little. And if it breaks, you're going to lose the integrity of that entire stitch line. So that's something to bear in mind when you're building a pair of these. Winter time, the long, cold, dark winters in Canada, not only did they do things like I'm doing now, but it was a time for storytelling. And I have a great historical story. I was out snowshoeing with a friend the other day, and we got lots of snow. We got at least 3 feet on the level. And we were snowshoeing along, and he was telling me that his mother had kept amazing records of their family history. And he related this story to me about his ancestor named Peter Reeser. So Peter was born Christmas Day, 1775 in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And later the father, Christian, he moved the family to Franklin County, Pennsylvania. And because they were Mennonites, it went against their religious beliefs to serve in the military. So given the time period, 1775, that didn't go over so well with their neighbors. Anyway, as a young man, Peter's ordered by his father to head north to Canada to check out this new country and to see if it's suitable for them to perhaps buy land and move the family north. So Peter grooms the horse, saddles up, packs a few provisions, starts on a 500-mile journey that takes him 7 weeks, a little over 7 weeks. And he arrives at a place called Little York, which in modern times is the city of Toronto. Not much more than a village at that time. Anyway, he's directed sort of north along the Rouge Valley because there's lots of timber and there's rivers and there's potential water power. And by happen chance, he runs to a fellow by the name of Frederick Baron de Hone, who was an ex-military officer. And he saw this fine horse that Peter was riding, and he offered him 600 acres of land right on the Little Rouge River, complete with water privileges for the horse and saddle. So Peter agrees, papers are drawn up, and Peter's leave, they shake hands. Peter takes the bridle off the horse and puts the halter on. And the officer, ex-officer, objects to this, and Peter said, well, the bargain was for the horse and the saddle. So Peter throws the bridle over his shoulder and he makes the trek, 500-mile trek back to Franklin County, Pennsylvania, and reports back to his father. There's no account of how long the journey took him on foot to get back, and it took him 7 weeks on horse to get there. So one can speculate there, perhaps twice, 3 times as long. Anyway, he reports to his father about this amazing property that he's purchased. And in 1804, the father makes a long journey with the entire extended family north. And they settle along the Little Rouge River, and they had water privileges, so they could build mills. And Peter built his first house along the shores of the Little Rouge River, just north of Toronto. Anyway, I digress. I've got 2 stitches left to go here, and the sole will be done, and it's on to forming the foot. So at this point, once I get my last stitch done here, we are going to finish this off. I'm going to actually take this last stitch and cross over into the start of the stitches from the first side that I did. Come back across that with a stitch, which is going to seal up the toe. And one more stitch up to the top, and then we finish off this part of the job. So once we've come through the last time, I like to finish them off, because if the knot ever does go, if I've gone through 2 or 3 of the previous stitches, because it's waxed and they're all going to sort of form into each other, it tends to keep its integrity even if I were to lose this final knot I'm going to make. And one more. Almost one more. Here we go. And I'm simply going to put a turn, double turn in my lacing, come back through the loop, and pull that and work that guy down in nice and tight, and cut him off. Done. So we have completed sole. So as you can see, it's stitched, continuously stitched completely around. And the next step is to get my old shoe back off, and I'm going to use my foot as a model to make the top. Okay, so I get my foot in, find out where it sort of feels comfortable, a little bit of room for the toe, and about 1/3 of the way back is where I want my center seam to end. If I come too far, it's impossible to get the moccasin on. You've got to get the bulk of your foot into the toe. So I'm making a line from the center point, and I'm going to make this a little bit bigger because I can trim it down, but it's pretty hard to add to it. And my center seam is going to come in about there. Okay, now the bold part, I cut that off. Okay, so I've cut off this, and I kind of like the look of that. Maybe a little surplus there, but I don't mind a little extra room because I'm going to be putting in like a beaver hide or muskrat or something for an insole, just for extra warmth. But it's sort of pretty much the center. It's nice and tight along the side of my foot, so that's going to work. So we're going to overlap this guy here. Make sure it's up tight on the side of my foot, and that's where I want the apex of my stitch to go. So something like so. And then I'm going to take my pencil and we're going to mark that. Should work. So I got to get started with the first stitch here, and then I'll demonstrate. One can simply use, and often I've seen center seam moccasins where they just use a whip stitch.
It doesn't seal as well. It's not as strong a hit stitch, so we're going to use the baseball stitch here. Get this guy started. Get a knot in the end. Cut that off later. Okay, so the difference with this stitch is instead of going over and under and out and over and under and out, we're going to go through the first time. I'm going to strengthen that up by putting a second complete stitch in the toe, right in the toe area. And we'll cut that tag off after. So we're going to come from here. Instead of going down, we're going to come underneath and go through. We want these stitches fairly tight. So we come through and over. And then instead of going on the outside, we're going to go on the inside again. And again, because it's commercial tanned hide, we've got to step in a little bit more. If it was brain tanned, this would be a prettier, finer looking stitch. So again, underneath, fairly close to the other one, out through. And it does put those nice little puckers in them, particularly if one uses brain tanned. Underneath, up through, underneath, and up through. So I'm going to sew about an inch, inch and a half, and I'm going to retry it on my foot before I go too far, because if I have to do any trimming, I can just simply undo these laces, trim it back, and redo the first inch and a half. But I think it's going to be fairly close. Okay, so I've got the first inch and a half done, and you can see how tight a stitch that is. It really seals it up. Once we get these guys greased with bear fat, it's going to be pretty good moccasin. So let's see if how it's going to look. Whether I think it's pretty close. Yep, that's going to be pretty close. So we're a little off skew down there, but it doesn't matter. We're going to carry on there. One day the wellerman come to bring us sugar, tea, and rum. One day when the tonguing is done, we'll take our leave and go. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Hey! One day the wellerman come to bring us sugar, tea, and rum. One day when the tonguing is done, we'll take our leave and go. I mentioned you don't need enough thread to go back, but you do need enough thread to come up, and I'm awful close to running out here. I think I'm just going to do this. So this will be my last stitch. I think it's going to fit pretty good, but I am really running out of material here. So at the top, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to take this thread in and out. I am. So out of the needle, get the needle in. Yep,
thrifty. They were thrifty in the 1700s, but frugal's one thing. There we go, we're in. So to finish it off, this is quite simple. I'm going to pull this guy through. I'm going to put my needle through one more time. I'll pick up my thread. I'm going to pull through, and I don't have enough to tie a knot. Okay, what I'm going to do is tie that back in. I'm going to put another stitch in that. I just didn't have quite enough material, but let's see how it looked like. So pretty even, pretty much up the center of the toe, a little bit off at the front, but it's just aesthetic. So we'll try that on my big old foot here and see if that's going to work. Here we go. So the sole's done, the center seam's done, and all that remains is the back, and I don't have to do much trimming here. I can pretty much just do the baseball stitch in the back. So I'll do that right now. Okay, so again, what I've used on the heel here is the baseball stitch, and you saw how I finished it off there. So the only thing I've got to do, well, I got a couple of things to do, dyeing for sure, but the next thing I'm going to do is fasten the upper part to the moccasin. So we're going to reverse this so that the smooth side, the two smooth sides meet. And because this is the left foot, the right foot, I want the long part of the foot to come out to the outside of my foot so it doesn't get caught as I'm walking or snowshoeing. So what we're going to do here is start the short, we're going to start on the short side by putting the two smooth sides together, and we're going to start right there with our first stitch. And you'll see when I get around to the other side, it's going to come right around, and that's going to leave the flap that will come across the front of the foot. So a little bit of a trick here when you're building moccasins. The first few I build, sometimes it's easier to have the knot on the inside. So it would be quite easy for me to put my first loop here and just come around, because I'm going to do a simple whip stitch on this. But if I do that, I end up with a knot inside that'll rub on my foot. So I'm going to start with the knot that I closed off the front center seam with, and by pulling that through first before I've attached this leather. That way that knot's buried between two pieces of leather. Then I'm going to put this at the apex there and come around and go through a second time. And because there's quite a bit of stress at that point, what I'm going to do is do this twice at this point, and I'll do it twice when I end up on the other side of the foot. So once and twice. So this doesn't need
doesn't need a stitch all the way around and then a stitch back. It doesn't need that much strength, but because we're using a simple whip stitch, you want it tight and you want those whip stitches fairly close together. So I like to put them about 1/8 of an inch apart, and it gives a nice finish like you see on the top of the moccasin that I finished here. Okay, so I finished my whip stitch all the way around. I finished that. I had a break there, so I had to pick that stitch up, and it's all knotted on the outside of the foot for comfort, so it's not caught in the inside. And because I kept those stitches really tight together, it should be a pretty good interface between the lower moccasin and the upper flap. So the only thing I got to do now is I got to put a few slots in here to put the thong through that'll tighten it on my foot and give me enough thong left to wrap around the ankle a couple of times to close out debris and snow. And then I have to dye it. So typically I use walnut dye, and you can dry the hull of black walnut shells. You can pulverize that down into a powder. You can buy that powder. I've used that, for example, on my hunting shirt here, but I often do shooting bags if I want a darker color than I've gotten from the smoking process of brain tanning, which is the last step. I did an experiment once where I had a pail full of walnuts, and I left them outside and they froze solid. They were harder than rocks, and they were blacker than your boot, bottom of your boot. And I needed to dye a piece of canvas, so I got the water boiling in a big pot, and I threw the canvas in and got it nice and warm, and I just threw in about a dozen of these black frozen rocks, if you would, and it turned out the best dye job I've ever done. So I'm not drying and pulverizing that anymore. I use that technique now for dyeing anything, any fabric or leather with walnut. But in these guys, I'm going to use like a leather dye. I don't have any walnuts at the moment. So yeah, I'm going to see if this guy fits, and if it does, we're on to the next step. So this is the time where I can, as I mentioned earlier, I can take that back stitch out if for any reason my calculations have been wrong here. Oh, that fits like a glove. Fits like a glove. So the flap's going to go to the outside, and I've got one pretty much completed moccasin here. They're going to be a good pair, a really good pair of mocks.